Jack Miller wasn't anyone special, or at least, that's what he told himself every morning when he woke up. Life in his one-bedroom apartment was a loop of barely surviving. He trudged to his job at Biocore Labs, where he washed glassware and handled the mundane tasks no one else wanted. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Most of the time that particular Thursday, Jack's morning routine was already off to a bad start. His alarm didn't go off, his coffee machine sputtered out its last gasp of life, and as he rushed out the door, he promptly stepped into a puddle left by the morning rain. "Perfect," he muttered, looking down at his soaked sneaker. He shuffled off toward the bus stop, trying not to think about how cold his toes were. At work, things weren't any better. His boss, Dr. Lauren Stapleton, a woman who seemed to exist solely to remind Jack of his inadequacies, stood with arms crossed as he walked in 10 minutes late. "Jack," she said with her trademark sigh, the one that carried the weight of years of disappointment, "if I had $1 for every time you were late, you'd be able to retire early." "Got it." Jack gave her a sheepish grin, though he felt the heat creeping into his cheeks. Stapleton didn't smile. "The centrifuge broke again." "Clean it up." The centrifuge always broke, and cleaning it meant hours of scrubbing bits of God knows what off the walls and ceiling of the small lab. Jack grabbed a mop and got to work. As he scrubbed, his co-workers passed by, some offering smirks, others pretending not to notice him at all. By lunchtime, Jack was exhausted. He grabbed a sandwich from the vending machine, a tasteless, plastic-wrapped excuse for food, and sat down in the corner of the break room. He had just taken his first bite when he overheard two researchers talking at the next table, and the results were off the charts. Evolutionary markers we've never seen before. Jack tuned them out. Science jargon wasn't his thing. He spent the rest of his lunch scrolling through his phone, pretending he didn't feel the weight of his coworkers' judgmental gazes. The rest of the day passed in a blur of cleaning and running errands for people who barely remembered his name. By the time his shift ended, Jack felt like a wrung-out sponge. He threw on his jacket and headed for the bus stop, eager to leave the lab behind. It was on his walk home that everything changed. Jack didn't see the construction crane at first. He was too busy scrolling through his phone, trying to distract himself from the misery of his day. But when a loud, metallic groan filled the air, he looked up just in time to see the beam falling. It was massive, a hulking piece of steel that seemed to hang in the air for a split second before plummeting straight toward him. Instinct kicked in. Jack dove to the side, rolling across the pavement as the beam crashed down where he'd been standing moments before. He felt the rush of air, the vibration of the impact reverberating through the ground. When he sat up, his heart pounding, he realized he wasn't hurt. "Not a scratch, whoa," said a bystander, a man with a baseball cap and a bag of groceries. "How'd you move so fast?" Jack didn't have an answer. His hands were shaking, and his knees felt weak, but he wasn't injured. He wasn't even out of breath. "You're lucky, man," the guy said, shaking his head. "That thing would have squashed you flat." Jack nodded numbly and stumbled away, his mind racing. He couldn't explain what had just happened. One moment, he'd been standing still, and the next, he'd moved with a speed and precision that didn't feel normal. When he got home, Jack collapsed onto his couch, replaying the incident in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. His hands didn't tremble the way they usually did after a scare. His body felt lighter, stronger. He touched his chest, half expecting to feel his heart hammering, but his pulse was steady. He glanced at the coffee table, where a stack of unopened mail sat gathering dust. On top was an old journal with a leather cover, something he'd picked up from his father's storage unit after he passed. Jack had never been close to his dad, a reclusive scientist who spent more time in his lab than with his family. But for some reason, Jack felt compelled to open the journal now. Inside were pages of notes, diagrams, and what looked like DNA sequences. The handwriting was messy but familiar, his father's unmistakable scrawl. One phrase caught his eye, repeated over and over: "Evolution awakening." Jack frowned. What the hell is this? As he flipped through the pages, something metallic fell out and clinked onto the coffee table. It was a small bookmark, sleek and silver, with an odd, almost organic texture. Curious, Jack picked it up. The moment his fingers touched it, a sharp pain shot through his hand. Ah! He dropped the bookmark and looked at his palm. A tiny bead of blood welled up where the metal had pricked him. But before his eyes, the wound closed itself, the skin knitting back together in seconds. Jack stared at his hand, his breath catching in his throat. That's not normal. He picked up the bookmark again, this time holding it carefully between his fingers. It was warm, almost alive, and as he turned it over, he noticed tiny symbols etched into the surface, symbols that matched the ones in his father's journal. A sudden wave of dizziness washed over him. Jack stumbled to his feet, clutching his head as his vision blurred. For a moment, he thought he might pass out, but then the feeling passed, replaced by a strange clarity. It was as if his senses had been dialed up to 11. He could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, smell the rain-soaked earth outside, and see every speck of dust floating in the air. What's happening to me? He whispered. Over the next few days, Jack tried to convince himself that it was all in his head. He went about his routine, pretending everything was normal. But the changes were impossible to ignore. His reflexes were sharper, his strength greater, and his mind faster. Tasks that had once seemed difficult now felt trivial, and he found himself solving problems at work that had stumped even the senior researchers. Word spread quickly. Jack the genius, his co-workers called him, half in jest, half in awe. Even Dr. Stapleton seemed impressed, though she'd never admit it out loud. For the first time in his life, Jack felt like he was more than just a background character in his own story, but with the changes came new challenges. Jack began to notice strange occurrences, lights flickering when he entered a room, electronic devices malfunctioning in his presence. And then there was the dog. The first time Jack saw the dog, it was sitting outside his apartment building, its fur matted and its leg twisted at an unnatural angle. It looked up at him with intelligent, almost human eyes. "Hey, buddy," Jack said, kneeling down. "You okay?" The dog didn't move, but its eyes seemed to bore into Jack's soul. He felt an odd connection, as if the creature was trying to communicate with him. Against his better judgment, Jack scooped the dog into his arms and carried it inside. He named it Barkley, after the basketball player, though the dog didn't seem to care for the name. Over the next few days, Barkley's leg healed faster than it should have, and Jack noticed other strange things. The dog had an uncanny way of predicting Jack's actions, moving before Jack even made a decision. And then there were the dreams. Jack started having vivid, otherworldly dreams, visions of stars and galaxies, of strange creatures watching him from the darkness. He often woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. Barkley would be there, staring at him with those knowing eyes. One night, as Jack sat on the couch, flipping through his father's journal, the TV flickered on by itself. Static filled the screen, and a voice crackled through the speakers. "Jack Miller," it said, mechanical and cold. "You are the key." Jack froze. "What the?" Before he could react, the TV shut off, and the room plunged into silence. Barkley growled, a low, menacing sound that made the hairs on Jack's neck stand up. Something was coming. And Jack had the sinking feeling that his life was about to get a lot more complicated. Jack stared at the darkened TV, his pulse quickening. The voice, it had been mechanical, inhuman. It wasn't the kind of glitch that happened on old hardware. The words had been deliberate, directed at him. He gripped the edge of the couch, trying to steady himself, but his thoughts churned like a storm. Barkley's growl deepened. The dog's ears were flat against its head, its body tense. Jack followed its gaze to the corner of the room, where shadows pooled unnaturally, as if the light from the lamp couldn't quite reach there. He squinted, his heart hammering. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a ripple in the darkness, like ink spreading through water. The next moment, it was gone. "Okay," Jack muttered, trying to convince himself he wasn't losing his mind. He leaned forward and placed a comforting hand on Barkley's head. "Just a weird glitch, right? Old TV acting up. Nothing to freak out about." But Barkley didn't relax. The dog's eyes remained locked on the corner. Unblinking, Jack shook his head and turned back to his father's journal. The pages felt heavier in his hands now, the scrawled diagrams and notes more ominous. His dad had been obsessed with something, some kind of breakthrough he hadn't lived to share. Jack's own awakening, the bizarre changes in his body, and now this. They had to be connected. He flipped to a page near the back of the journal, where his father had drawn a series of interlocking spirals that looked almost alive. Below the spirals, in bold letters, were the words, "The signal attracts them. Be prepared." Jack ran his fingers over the words, his chest tightening. "Attracts who?" he murmured. As if in answer, the building's fire escape groaned outside his window. The sound was sharp and metallic, like someone, or something, was climbing it. Jack froze. He looked at Barkley, who was already standing, hackles raised, teeth bared. The groaning sound came again, closer this time. Jack's instincts screamed at him to run, but something deep inside, something primal and newly awakened, urged him to fight. His body moved on its own. He grabbed a heavy metal wrench from his workbench and crept toward the window, his muscles taut. The room felt oppressively silent, every creak of the floorboards under his feet magnified in his ears. He reached the window and peered out cautiously. The alley below was empty, shrouded in dim, flickering light from the street lamp. But just as Jack began to lower the wrench, a shadow darted past the window, moving impossibly fast. He stepped back, heart pounding. Before he could process what was happening, the glass shattered inward, and a figure leapt into the room. It wasn't human. The intruder was sleek and alien, its body covered in dark, chitinous plates that reflected the dim light like polished obsidian. Its limbs were long and segmented, ending in razor-sharp claws that looked like they could cut through steel. Its face, or what passed for one, was a featureless mask of smooth black, except for a faint, pulsating glow at its center. Jack didn't think. He swung the wrench with all his might, aiming for the creature's head. The impact landed with a resounding crack, but the creature barely flinched. It turned toward him, its glowing center flaring brighter, and lunged. Jack dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the swipe of its claws. Barkley launched itself at the creature, teeth sinking into its arm. The alien hissed, a sharp, high-pitched sound that made Jack's ears ache, and flung the dog across the room. Barkley hit the wall with a yelp but scrambled back to its feet, growling fiercely. Adrenaline coursed through Jack's veins. He swung the wrench again, this time aiming for the creature's torso. The blow landed with enough force to knock it back a step, but the alien quickly recovered, its movements eerily fluid. "You've got to be kidding me," Jack muttered, backing toward the door. His newfound strength and reflexes had saved him once, but he didn't know how long he could hold out against something so fast and deadly. The creature charged again, but this time, Jack didn't dodge. He planted his feet and swung upward, catching the alien under its chin. The glow at its center flickered, and it let out a distorted shriek, stumbling backward. Before Jack could press his advantage, the alien's body began to dissolve, its chitinous plates melting into a viscous black liquid that seeped into the cracks of the floorboards. In seconds, it was gone, leaving no trace of its presence except the shattered window and the deep gashes it had carved into the walls. Jack stood there, panting, the wrench still clutched in his hands. Barkley padded over to him, limping slightly, and nudged his leg with its nose. "Good boy," Jack said, his voice shaking. He crouched down to inspect the dog's injuries, but Barkley didn't seem too worse for wear. "What the hell was that thing?" He didn't expect an answer, but as he looked into Barkley's eyes, he saw something unsettling, something intelligent. The dog tilted its head, almost as if it understood the question, and let out a low, mournful whine. Jack sank onto the couch, his mind racing. The attack wasn't random. The creature had come for him. His father's journal, the strange signal, the voice on the TV, it all fit together in a way that made his skin crawl. He wasn't just changing. He was attracting attention, and not the good kind. The next morning, Jack woke to find Barkley standing by the door, staring at it intently. A soft knock echoed through the apartment. Jack's pulse quickened. He grabbed the wrench again and approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" he called out. "Jack Miller." The voice was calm, almost too calm. "We need to talk." Jack glanced at Barkley, who growled softly. He tightened his grip on the wrench and cracked the door open just enough to see who was outside. A man and a woman stood in the hallway, both dressed in crisp black suits. They could have passed for government agents if not for the unsettling way they stood, too still, too perfect, like mannequins brought to life. "Who are you?" Jack demanded. The man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We represent an organization with an interest in your unique talents. May we come in?" Jack didn't budge. "How do you know about me?" The woman stepped forward, her expression eerily blank. "You've recently undergone significant changes, haven't you? Faster reflexes, increased strength, heightened awareness. These are the signs of an evolutionary awakening. You're not the first, but you are unique." Jack's heart raced. "What do you mean, not the first?" The man's smile widened. "There have been others. Some embraced their potential. Others resisted. We're here to ensure you don't make the same mistakes." Jack didn't like the way he said that. He opened the door a little wider, ready to demand answers, but before he could speak, Barkley lunged, barking furiously. The two strangers stepped back, their perfect composure faltering for the first time. "Call off the dog," the man said sharply, his tone losing its practiced calm. Jack hesitated. Something about these people felt wrong, off in a way he couldn't quite explain. He trusted Barkley's instincts more than his own. "I think you should leave." The woman's expression darkened. "You don't understand what's at stake. The signal has been sent. They're coming, and you're the only one who can stop them." "Who's coming?" Jack demanded, but the strangers didn't answer. They exchanged a look, then turned and walked away, their movements unnervingly synchronized. Jack shut the door and leaned against it, his mind spinning. He didn't know who those people were or what they wanted, but one thing was clear: his life was no longer his own. He looked down at Barkley, who wagged his tail tentatively. "Guess it's just you and me, huh?" Jack said. The dog barked once in agreement. Jack picked up his father's journal and flipped back to the page with the spirals. Whatever was happening, whatever his father had discovered, it wasn't over. The signal had been sent, and Jack had the sinking feeling that whoever, or whatever, was coming next would make the alien from last night look like a warm-up act. Jack couldn't sleep that night. He lay on his couch, Barkley curled up on the floor nearby, his father's journal open in his lap. The spirals on the page seemed to pulse in the dim light of his desk lamp, almost alive. The stranger's cryptic warning echoed in his mind. "They're coming, and you're the only one who can stop them." His gut told him that whoever they were, they weren't just coming for him. The attack last night, the strange visitors this morning, it all pointed to something bigger, something that could put more than just his life at risk. But what was he supposed to do? He was just a guy with a wrench and a rapidly mutating biology. As the hours ticked by, Jack's mind drifted to his father. The old man had always been distant, more interested in his research than his family. Jack had resented him for it, but now he wished he'd paid more attention, asked more questions. Whatever his dad had been working on, it was the key to everything that was happening. And Jack needed answers. The journal wasn't enough. It was full of diagrams and notes that might as well have been written in another language. He needed someone who could make sense of it all. His fingers hovered over his phone as he debated his next move. He knew a guy, Dr. Alton Quinn, one of his father's old colleagues. They'd worked together at a private lab outside the city before Jack's father had gone completely off the grid. If anyone could explain the madness in these pages, it was Quinn. Jack dialed the number, his heart thudding in his chest. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Hello? Dr. Quinn? It's Jack Miller. Thomas Miller's son." There was a pause, long enough for Jack to wonder if Quinn had hung up. Then the voice returned, quieter now. "Jack. I was wondering when I'd hear from you." Jack swallowed. "You knew my dad was working on something unusual, didn't you? I think it's starting to affect me. I need your help." Quinn sighed. "Your father warned me this might happen. Meet me at my lab in an hour. I'll explain everything." The call ended abruptly, leaving Jack staring at the phone. Barkley looked up, as if sensing Jack's unease. "Guess we're going on a little field trip," Jack said, grabbing his jacket. Barkley wagged his tail and followed him to the door. The drive to Quinn's lab was uneventful, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every pair of headlights in his rearview mirror made his skin crawl, and every shadow along the roadside seemed to stretch toward him. When he finally pulled into the lab's parking lot, he exhaled a shaky breath. The building was small and unassuming, its windows dark. A single light glowed above the entrance. Quinn met him at the door, his weathered face etched with concern. He ushered Jack and Barkley inside without a word, locking the door behind them. The lab was cluttered, its shelves crammed with equipment and stacks of papers. Quinn gestured for Jack to sit at a metal table in the center of the room. "Your father was a brilliant man," Quinn began, sitting across from Jack. "But his work, it went beyond what anyone else was doing. He believed that human evolution wasn't random. He thought there was a code, a hidden mechanism in our DNA, waiting to be unlocked." Jack placed the journal on the table and slid it toward Quinn. This was his. He called it Evolution Awakening. Quinn flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. "This is it," he murmured. "The breakthrough he was chasing. Your father thought he'd found a way to trigger the next stage of human evolution. He called it the Awakening Code." Jack leaned forward. "And he used it on me, didn't he? Before he died?" Quinn hesitated, then nodded. "He must have. I warned him not to experiment on himself or anyone else, but Thomas was always reckless when it came to his work." "What does it mean? What's happening to me?" Quinn closed the journal and looked Jack in the eye. "Your body is rewriting itself, Jack. Your reflexes, strength, intelligence, it's all part of the awakening. But it's not just you. The signal your father sent out when he activated the code, it's drawn attention." "From who?" Jack asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Quinn hesitated, his face grim. "Not who. What? There are forces out there, Jack, beings who see humanity as nothing more than raw material for their experiments. The signal was like a flare in the dark. They know about you now, and they'll do whatever it takes to harvest the code." Jack's stomach turned. "The alien last night, it was one of them, wasn't it?" Quinn nodded. "A scout. There will be more." Barkley growled softly, his eyes fixed on the window. Jack followed his gaze and froze. Outside, shadows moved unnaturally, coalescing into shapes that shouldn't exist. A low hum filled the air, growing louder by the second. "They're here," Quinn said, his voice barely a whisper. The window shattered as two figures burst into the room. They were similar to the creature Jack had fought before, but larger, their chitinous armor glinting in the fluorescent light. Jack shoved the table forward, knocking one of them off balance, and grabbed a nearby metal rod. Quinn scrambled for a drawer, pulling out a strange, gun-like device. "Keep them back," Quinn shouted, aiming the weapon. A burst of blue light shot from the barrel, striking one of the creatures and sending it sprawling. Jack swung the rod at the second creature, but it caught the weapon in its claws and yanked it away. Before it could strike, Barkley lunged, sinking his teeth into the alien's leg. The creature hissed and kicked the dog away, but Jack seized the moment to tackle it, slamming it into the wall. "Get the journal!" Quinn yelled, firing another shot at the first creature. As it recovered, Jack grabbed the journal and stuffed it into his jacket. "What about you? Go!" Quinn barked, his eyes blazing with determination. "I'll hold them off." Jack hesitated, but another screech from the creatures snapped him into action. He scooped up Barkley and bolted for the door, sprinting into the night. As he ran, the lab exploded behind him, a fiery blast that lit up the sky. Jack stumbled, shielding Barkley with his body as debris rained down around them. When he looked back, the lab was a smoldering ruin. Quinn was gone. Jack's chest heaved as he staggered toward his car, his mind racing. The journal was still tucked safely in his jacket, but the weight of what it represented was crushing. His father's code, the aliens hunting him, Quinn's sacrifice, it was all too much. But he couldn't stop now. He had to finish what his father started. Not just for himself, but for everyone. The next stage of evolution had begun, and Jack Miller was at the center of it all.